My name is Christopher Yu. I'm a professor of law, communication, and computer science at the University of Pennsylvania. And I wanted to thank the organizers of this year's IIC Washington, D.C. Forum to invite me once again to speak and be part of this excellent venue that has created so much benefit to the world in terms of creating dialogue on communications issues. I'd also say what a pleasure it is to be on a panel with so many of my friends and colleagues who I've worked with in different capacities, and even some new friends who are wonderful new connections, and I look forward to working together with in the future. So giving the keynote that launches the last panel of the conference provides a nice opportunity to try to pull together some of the threads that have already been discussed, but also to take a look forward to try to figure out what we can learn and distill from the things we've discussed here over the last several days, and to turn them into changes and workable policies for the future. And as part of our conversation and our panel here today, I'd like to try to set the stage for some interesting discussions that we can have together. So, speaking just briefly, there have been a number of really interesting lessons, both from the COVID-19 pandemic, but also from a project I'm leading called One World Connected. One World Connected is an attempt to study empirically innovative ways people have undertaken around the world to close the digital divide and to connect more people to the internet. It's been interesting lessons about trying to avoid people to reinvent the wheel. And I would say that from my study through One World Connected and looking at COVID-19, I see basically, I point out 5 sort of high-level lessons, if you will. The first is the critical need for internet connectivity. Roughly half the world is not online, and we've seen the broader literature about the economic benefits of internet connectivity. Often what we're seeing now in the pandemic era, we are seeing that the case has been easier to make than ever. At a time when people have been under stay-at-home orders, internet connectivity has become critical for people to continue to work, to continue their educations, to receive healthcare, and a host of other services in ways that we've never really seen before. And it makes the case that much easier. We still need more information on exactly the ways it benefits people and the extent to which it benefits people, because even if you know that it's beneficial, allowing policymakers to know how to allocate resources along different lines becomes critically essential. And some work I'm doing on the impact on well-being, for example, in Bangladesh and Ghana, is an attempt to further that as well. Interestingly, the second point I'd like to make is that there's been a large-scale focus on increasing the availability of internet and lowering the cost, which are areas that have been traditionally very familiar to regulators and ministries of communication. What's interesting is I think the pandemic has really put a spotlight on the importance of quality. Many people who had some level of connectivity didn't find it sufficient to support distance learning. A situation I know from a host family of my wife's, some colleagues of my wife's from the time she was an exchange student, they struggled in Italy, even though they had connectivity, to be able to upload videos and to communicate in basic ways. And what we'll discover is that actually changes the policy approach that's implicit in the way that regulators have to deal with fostering internet connectivity. In addition, in addition to thinking about internet connectivity and quality, there has to be an eye towards sustainability as well. So what's fascinating is in One World Connected, many of the new ventures that were launched didn't really have a revenue model, and they had no ability to transition into being self-sustaining, in which case they would only survive as long as external funding was provided. Interestingly, also, much of the discussion talks about capital expenses and how to build networks. What we've learned is that operating expenses are actually as important, if not actually more important. Because even if a build, no matter how cheap, no matter how expensive, if it's operating at a loss, if it's losing money on an ongoing basis, it won't survive, even if you have the most cost-effective capital expenditure build. And so understanding those dynamics become very important. In addition to the previous things which I've discussed, which are what we often call the supply side, which is dealing with the network, there's an entirely different dimension about adoption. And this can involve digital skills training, providing privacy and security, educating people on the relevance and the importance of it and what it can do for you. And what we've learned from When We're Connected and other studies, surveys done around the world in both the developing world and the developed world, is that any solution that focuses only on connectivity is going to be incomplete and runs the risk of failing, because unless we overcome the adoption problems, we will find that the old adage, if you build it, they will come, is simply not true. And there has to be some more that you can, more elements to the program in order to make sure we get the outcomes that everyone around the world wants to see. And perhaps one of the most unpleasant surprises of watching the world as it's developed is the fact that the digital divide doesn't automatically get better when you increase connectivity. On a global scale, we found that as internet connectivity, as we connected more of the unconnected people in the world, actually a smaller and smaller percentage of them, for example, were women. And we also see in that these problems happened under the COVID situation, is that the most vulnerable groups, whether they're low income or migrants or part-time workers or young workers, are among the people who are hurt the most. And in fact, you often see them adversely affected by their inability to access internet in ways that are troublesome and represent an independent policy problem. So at the same time that there are lessons, there's some really interesting opportunities arising out of the pandemic and the development, the efforts made to connect more people to the world, to the internet. So what's fascinating is COVID-19 has forced a lot of different people to change the way they use connectivity and the internet. For example, in work, we're connecting from a distance and very, very often in different situations, and finding ways to try to continue with our economic livelihoods without, without being able to meet in person. Obviously, healthcare, education, and what is really interesting is that has shaken people loose to new possibilities. So there's the mundane ones, many meetings that we used to think had to be done in person are now being done effectively remotely. And we find, for example, conferences like medical conferences that are designed to disseminate information are often attracting audiences that are much, much larger in a much more cost-effective way that may lead to permanent changes. You also see interestingly, many teachers who were reluctant or didn't have the means to develop working on ed tech, educational technologies, because of the pandemic, have been forced to try to experiment with them in a more accelerated way and to develop the new curricula and to try to find new ways to do things. The healthcare industry, which has been highly regulated and usually insisted on certain patterns, are discovering that many treatment issues or many situations do not require in-person visits to the same extent as previously thought. In addition, the fact that COVID-19 came unexpectedly from nowhere, it provides the exact kind of unexpected change, or what we often call an exogenous shock, that creates an opportunity, a very well-formed opportunity to study what's working and what's not working. And scholars around the world are starting to invest in to try to understand this, to try to learn from it. Now, why is that important? What we need to understand is actually what the real lessons from the pandemic in those home solutions really are. So what we saw initially, for example, was an outpouring of literature that builds on some older literature that says, you know what, people were maintained remarkable productivity even though they were at home. And that is a good news lesson. On the other hand, what we're discovering is many companies were saying we're going to close our offices and this work from home approach is going to be permanent. What we've seen now is a secondary literature to understand that, one, it doesn't work for all tasks, that there are some that are more team-oriented or involve sort of a more informal collaborative environment that are harder to replicate online. And in addition, we're finding that there are certain activities that we are leveraging the previous relationships we've built through in-person interactions pre-COVID. So for example, mentoring, or even more importantly, onboarding new staff has become much more difficult because of informal interactions, both around the office, but coming and going from meetings where you can just lightly grab somebody and just engage them on a lower level are just much harder to come by. And so we're gonna have to find new solutions for doing this and understanding when it's not going to work. For another example, education works differently at different levels and different formats, and we need to understand how to leverage the benefits of online education, which allows, for example, with good tools, individualization at a level that's never been possible before. But on the other hand, for elementary education, it seems to be less effective. And what we're discovering that, in fact, solutions can't just be dropped in, they need collateral support, additional curriculum, additional materials, training, different support mechanisms that may be different from what we're used to. And from this, we have to make an understanding that some of the changes induced by COVID are likely to persist and some are not. And understanding what they're going to be, what those are going to be and how they're going to go together matters a great deal. The other opportunity to me is in the spirit of One World Connected, is we're trying to leverage what we learned from other situations. And so we're seeing a large number of international collaborations. I have had the chance to work with IFT, the Inter-American Development Bank, and Comcast in the past, and really enjoyed that. We are part of now a number of education initiatives, such as the GIG initiative, co-led by the ITU and UNICEF, who has the ambition to connect every school and create a stable financing model for it. We're participating in the Broadband Commission's working group on school connectivity, and figuring out also in another organization, there's a project on education for the most marginalized post-COVID-19 that looks at not connecting schools, which assumes we're back in person, but how do we set the stage for the next pandemic that will inevitably come? And then in addition, I'm part of the Penn and One World Connected as part of GSMA's Mobile Digital Skills Alliance, and all these different efforts are designed to help us learn from case to case. So I actually think there are, lastly, I'll talk about some policy changes and policy responses. So first, regulators have long emphasized connectivity, increasing connectivity and lowering cost. The quality dimension requires greater bandwidth, and which means more investment. And what that means, if we're going to invest more in the network instead of just repurposing existing telephone and cable lines, we're going to have to actually allow people to create higher end products and then charge more for them for the higher value in order to enable this sort of growth and the improvement of the underlying system. Another point is to take a plural and flexible approach to technology. What we've learned is that one size fits all doesn't work. There's a tendency many people have to fall in love with a particular technology, such as fiber or 5G. Very simply, to put a very simple point, 5G and fiber are unlikely to be effective rural technologies just because of the nature of their 5G small cell nature and fiber's need for density. And so understanding what different things that actually might work better, and understanding there's not just one problem, there's different problems, urban, ex-urban, rural, but even within rural, the small villages are easy to serve than the surrounding areas, which can be opportunistically linked off the villages, and then there's the hyper-rural areas, and each require a different analysis. In addition, there's often a fascination for the shiny new technology. We've seen a lot of coverage of drones and weather balloons, which when we've seen them experimentally deployed in disaster relief have not worked particularly well. And our study through One World Connected reveals that very old and boring established technologies have often delivered more connectivity to the world. This is cellular Wi-Fi, and general forms of fixed wireless are often an underappreciated model that need to be studied better. Studying brings my next point. We need to learn from case to case. A lot of times people are so busy deploying things, they don't take the time to actually study what they're doing. Actually, this is critically important in the early stages to learn what works so we can inform the future and leverage our learning as we go forward. And then we have to resist the temptation that some people are using to use the pandemic to revive some old debates. And most of them can be answered very easily with data and actually looking what the reality is. So for example, many people think that they're arguing for symmetric allocation of bandwidth, that is upload and download bandwidth should be the same. And they point to the fact that we're now doing more from home and we're doing more intensive things such as video. What you discover is that is simply inconsistent with actual data and evidence-driven decision-making. Bandwidth utilization remains extremely asymmetric even in the COVID era. And then in addition, you see numbers of calls for public financing. There may be some modest changes created by COVID, but if something wasn't sustainable prior to the pandemic, you need to actually analyze and make sure if something's actually changed enough, because we found that optimism to be sometimes unwarranted and unhelpful. That's just a few thoughts I have to introduce what I hope is going to be a very interesting panel discussion. I'd like to thank the organizers again for inviting me and look forward to what I hope sure will be a fascinating discussion to follow.